If you're a man in any Western country, what the hell are you doing having kids? I understand the desire to have kids, and it's just innate within us to desire to procreate, to have our prodigy live on after us, to teach that individual everything that we've learned, to try to do our best to set up life for them, and when we're long and gone, to put them in the best position to flourish. But in many Western countries, especially for men, that is not an option. This is a good article. This is not too long ago that came out in March. This is March 5th, 2020. It says Windsor court ruling puts C19 hoax belief at center of custody fight. It says judge rules belief about C19 as a factor of whether a parent can keep his kid safe. And especially if you live in the West, your child, especially if you're a man, your child does not belong to you. Because at any given take, the courts can just take your kids away. They are no longer in your possession. They are now possessions of the state. The moment you sign that birth certificate, whatever state that you're in, or if you're here in Canada, this is, of course, is in Canada. Those kids do not belong to you. At any point in time, they can become wards in custody of the state. And as a result of that, the court system and the government will use every sort of manipulation tactic to get you to bend to their will. And this is why I say, especially if you're a young person, if you're a young man considering having children, the West is not the place for that. What I've done is what I advise many to do: get a trade, become proficient at that trade, stack your money, invest, and buy real estate abroad. And especially if your goal is to have kids, to do so in a land that benefits men, where you can actually have the opportunity to raise your kids without much meddling from the government, especially governments that are heavily leaning towards women, towards sort of womenism, anti-male, anti-masculine sort of behavior. It says a judge in Windsor has ruled that a person's vocal belief about C19 is a factor in child custody. Ontario Superior Court Justice George W. King denied a Windsor man interim custody of his kids because the man's fervent anti-masking belief means he wouldn't take appropriate actions to keep them safe from C19. So even though statistically kids overwhelmingly do not experience the same sort of ramifications as a geriatric patient with a long history of comorbidities would. But that doesn't matter. Even though the statistics show that even though for overall, it shows that overwhelmingly more than 99% of individuals survive this particular virus, but it doesn't matter. It's just one more thing that the government is going to utilize to hold your kids over you and basically dangle them in front of you, like, carrot on a stick to get you to do what they want you to do. And so I hope more men pay attention to this, especially if you're inclined to relationships and the desire to have children. The West is not the place for you. It's important to get that through your head, because I can't imagine what this poor man is going through, not being able to see his children in his own home, as it goes on to state. The decision notes that the man's belief of C19 to be a hoax and has boasted in public about flouting health restrictions such as masking and social distancing. So the politicians can do it. We've seen even in Canada, we've seen numerous different individuals who are basically in government who do the exact same thing. They flout the restrictions. They don't socially distance. They don't wear masks, etc. But it really doesn't matter, because you're not part of the club. And if you're not part of the club, well, then the restrictions are going to be placed on you. And all these other individuals are just going to say, oh, I'm sorry. And they're just going to go about their day with absolutely no sort of penalty. It says the health and welfare of the child, and by extension, their principal caregiver, should not be jeopardized because of his public behavior in promotion of his opinions, right? So if you have a particular belief that you do inculcate into your kids, and if the state or the local government does not agree with your now said beliefs, well then, as a result of that, especially if you end up in a divorce, Judge can utilize it against you, and this sets precedence moving forward for other areas where perhaps society will say, well, we don't particularly appreciate that belief that you have, so we find that your children could be in danger, so we're going to have to watch you and supervise you, as it goes on to state. Legal experts say the ruling is consistent with past custody rulings involving issues of children's health, but say it is significant because it articulates new standards and language specific to C-19, right? So they're setting a precedence. It says, I have concluded that the respondent's behavior is dictated by his worldview. It says everything else is subordinate. Everything else is subordinate to the view, including but not limited to his love for his children, the decision by the judge. It says, the justice makes clear that while the father is free to have whatever beliefs he wishes and to lawfully express them, the issue is in the impact of the health of his children. This is the big cases has been things like anti-vaccination or blood transfusions. And again, blood transfusions leaning more towards Jehovah's Witnesses or those who choose not to accept blood transfusions for their religious beliefs. So there is a series of cases there that the court can take direction from. It's just different disease. Previously, the man had custody of his children from Friday to Sunday afternoon, but the justice's new ruling only allows him to see his children 3 times a week at a supervised access center where he would be required to abide by all the conditions imposed by the facility as a precondition to access, right? So that means wearing a mask, socially distancing, make sure you wash your hands before you give your kids a hug for fear that you may infect them, even though all of the statistics show that that is to the contrary. In other countries, like for example in Sweden and other certain European countries, they've had children in school for the moment they realized that the science said that children are overwhelmingly not impacted by the disease, and so they opened up schools so that kids can go back into learning. But here in the West, that is not the case. And many of these, up until this day, there are certain states and counties where kids are still getting homeschooled via Zoom, even though statistics have shown that that form of education has been detrimental to kids. Many more kids are failing. Many individuals are, of course, experiencing the ramifications of depression, especially for youth who are growing up and they don't understand why they can't go and see certain individuals, why they have to wear masks, social distancing, etc., when they don't see it impacting other individuals' lives who are of the same age as them. And so for many of these individuals, unfortunately, they are forced to fall in line, because more than likely what will happen is that the courts can opt to take your children away. And this is actually quite interesting, especially in what we're hearing more so about, for example, like children who want to change their biological sex, or who are experience confusion, or if the class, the teacher or the state says that perhaps the child is confused, and so this has been flouted out there from the court system that maybe we'll give them some sort of blockers, puberty blockers, right? This is important when they start setting these precedences, because they can then reach back and be like, hey, we did this over here. Why can't we apply it in some way, shape, or form? Because you don't believe that it's okay for a kid to do X, Y, or Z, or because you're homophobic or whatever sort of ism that they want to attach to you. And now it calls into question your ability to parent. And of course, this is primarily speaking from the man's standpoint, but I would not want women to think that they are immune, as our next article shows, right? So this article, this was back from October 1st of 2020, and it says, no mask, no child custody. C-19 is a new factor in law. And it goes on to state here, Melanie Joseph wants to see her son, but a judge won't let her for no reason except that she won't wear a mask. How old is her son? 14 years, who has a history of asthma. And even kids who have a history of asthma still have very, very low risk of, primarily it's a disease that affects individuals who are 70 and above. And even many of the patients that I've taken care of, I've got just this is a good little tidbit. I received a patient. For those who don't know, I am a nurse. I've been a nurse almost 10 years now. Been 10 years in April. I received a patient yesterday from the emergency room, a person who tested positive 3 weeks ago on the 17th, right? And they were pairing that patient who was an actively symptomatic individual who was also a C19. And so I questioned it and I said, why are we putting, and that person came in for stroke, right? The person that I received came in for stroke. The person that I was taking care of both patients. And the other person was actively short of breath, who required 6 liters nasal cannula as well as a non-verb breather, which is a large amount of oxygen. And I questioned and I said, why is this patient who is actively symptomatic being paired with a patient who was not symptomatic? In fact, when I look back at the result, it only showed that the patient had tested positive, but not that the patient actually had symptoms even on their previous admission. So when I questioned it, they said that, well, we presume that because they tested positive on the 17th, that they're still, and I was like, well, why don't you just test them? And they said, we don't do that. I'm like, what? So for those who think that even in the hospital, that we follow the science, I beg to differ. And so my advice, as I said before, for those individuals who have the affinity, the desire to want to procreate, do not do so in the West. Do so in a country that suits you, where you will be treated with the most amount of fairness that you can, where you can raise your child according to your belief, and obviously not in a way that would impact that child negatively intentionally. Sometimes parents do their very best, and individuals cannot foresee how things will always turn out. So we actually try to do the very best that we can. But in no way, shape, or form should you allow what is happening in these countries to happen to you moving forward. You have been forewarned. This is not the route for you, especially as a man, especially if you're a man of color and you're looking to pass on everything that you've learned moving forward. The West is not for you.